Let's start off with the wheat over here. In your packages, there are two handouts that we supplied you on. One is a stem rust pamphlet here. Stem rust has gained a lot of attention over the past 4 or 5 years. As with most pathogens, they change over time. And stem rust has developed a new pathotype, a new race, this UG99, that has gained a lot of attention in the media and that. Started off in Africa, moved into the Middle East, and now is going into Asia and threatening global wheat production. And stem rust is probably the most important, or our poster child, when we come into effective resistance in managing a very economically important disease. From prior to the 1950s and that, stem rust was the most important wheat disease that we had in North America. Losses could have ranged anywhere from 20 to 80% due to stem rust. The development of stem rust resistant genes by Dr. Norman Borlaug, he actually won the Nobel Prize for this accomplishment. These genes that were introduced back then and that continue to be introduced has been effective and durable, or lasted for over 40 years. That's really unusual when we think of genetic genes that can last that long. When we think of these 46 lines here and the leaf rust genes that are in here, if they last 3 or 4 years, we're probably doing pretty good. If they last 5, that's quite an accomplishment. Things such as events, a few years ago we started getting calls and concerns about Vienna wheat, for instance. So we're starting to see more rust developing on that. In that case, what we ended up seeing was the development of new races, particularly race 24, that can take down that leaf rust LR24 gene, which is basically in this line here, as well as in other ones in this area. We can start seeing that line, or that gene, is no longer effective. What's your general idea in terms of, if we go from the front to the back of these? Do we see more or less in the front, or in the back?
Less in the back.
Less in the back. So what we're seeing is, if we were here, if we had done this and we were back 20, 30 years ago, we probably would have seen this area here would have had most of the leaf rust, and then these other lines back here would have been pretty green and more effective. What we're seeing though is that most of the lines up here, these 30 or 40 lines, are showing degrees more leaf rust. Back here, although we have some leaf rust, these are much more effective genes. These are the genes that we're trying to incorporate into the wheat varieties right now, today, to stay effective. You've got a handout. There's a second sheet in there on how to identify the different rust diseases, particularly when it comes to leaf rust, stripe rust, and stem rust. And then the handout that just came by shows you, or tries to explain, how this is occurring in that. When we think of leaf rust in wheat in Canada, and particularly in Ontario, we probably have the best diversity out there. We have the most aggressive races and the best diversity in Canada, even more so than Western Canada, where we have more wheat acres and all that. But in Ontario, we have a few things going for us. One is the environment, right? We have the Great Lakes, plus we also have a lot of different wheat groups, wheat classes. We grow many different types of wheat. All of these things can help in terms of the establishment of these races or mutations in the result. On the back of that sheet, also what you'll notice is that they're becoming much more complex. Each one of these races here can take down, as I said, 10, 15, 20 genes. So genes that were once effective, like in Vienna, are no longer effective. And that, although we're using wheat as our example, this is applicable to how we breed resistance in all crops. So whether it's corn, soybeans, wheat, etc. When we plant wheat and that, what's our first recommendation? What should we be doing to that wheat seed? Treat it, right? We should always treat. What we've done here with these 3 blocks is we've taken infested wheat, fusarium infested wheat. The first block is untreated. You can see the impact. Number 2 is a new seed treatment, Sidaxane or Vibrance from Syngenta. that has good fusarium rhizode control as well. And then in our third one here, we have, this would be comparable to a standard treatment that we have now, whether it's Dividend, Raxol, and that. All of our seed treatments that we have out there on wheat are very effective in managing most of the seed-borne and soil-borne wheat pathogens that we have out there. So the important moral of the story is when we get into wheat and that, we have to make sure we treat our seed. You'd be amazed with how many growers still call and ask whether I should be treating my wheat or not. It's a no-brainer when it comes to wheat seed. On the corn, let's go over these 3 corn plots here, the blocks. If you compare block 1, 2, and 3, just as an overall growth and color, which one looks the worst? Number 1, right? So it looks shorter, looks more yellow, right? This one, it has some Pythium in it. When we think of Pythium and Phytophthora, Pythium and Phytophthora are what we call our oomycetes or water mold pathogens. They really like moisture. But what if we had excess amounts this year? We've had a heck of a lot of water. And that. And also, the same thing as what we've seen with our leaf rust, Pythium is doing the same thing here. It is becoming or adapting to our environmental conditions as well. When we think of Pythium and Phytophthora, Pythium is one of those diseases or pathogens that as the temperature would increase, its activity would decrease. So when it would be turned 18, 19, 20 degrees, we would see less of it, would stop, and then the Phytophthora would kick in. But what we've been seeing in Ontario, as well as in Quebec, Eastern Ontario, and Ohio, and some other areas, is that Pythium now is becoming more heat tolerant. So now we can see it impacting or continue growing at 22, 23, 24, 25 degrees. So it's becoming, as opposed to just an early season 1 to 2 leaf pathogen, now it's affecting plants later on. When we think of Phytophthora, it can affect plants all the way through the season because it's pretty tolerant of those temperatures and that. So if we look at these 4 plots here, which one do you like the best? Or do you see any differences at all? Or would you like any of them? This is a good example of how if we have a pathogen and we have very little tolerance at all in the background, we have very little tolerance in corn to Pythium. Unlike Phytophthora in soybeans where we have some native or inherent tolerance. In this case, although we can see some subtle differences with these seed treatments, the fact that you've got a very susceptible background, you don't see the advantages as much of those seed treatments as you would have seen. And the other fact is this year the environment has been really good for getting this disease going, and to the point that we even hand planted these ones because we couldn't get our equipment in here because it was wet so long. So if you look at treatments 1, 2, 3, and 4, the pair of rows, which one do you like the best? Which one? Over here? No, we're on this block over here. 3? 3? Okay, number 1 is just our insecticide alone, a poncho, bear. Number 2 was our untreated. Number 3 was our fungicide, and what we used here was trifloxystrobin metalaxyl combo. And then number 4 was the fungicide, insecticide, and nematicide. And the nematicide we used here is one that we've been playing with or working with Bayer Votivo, a biological. And so although we see better development, number 3 looks better, the fact that seed treatments can only do so much when things are going stronger for or advantages of the pathogen, right? Now, if we look at plot number 3, number 2 here, Rhizoctonia, inoculated ones, much different, right? Which one of these? 1, 2, 3, or 4 do you like? Which one? 4? Because that's the one you were pointing at, right? Number 1 was our untreated. Number 2 was just our poncho insecticide alone. Remember, we don't have a lot of insect pressure in these plots, so we're not seeing as much. Number 3 would be our Fungicide Insecticide. Number 4 is our Fungicide Insecticide Nematicide. So now you can start seeing some more advantages here. And one thing we've seen over the past couple of years as we've been evaluating some of these products is where we have the nematicide included with a fungicide insecticide seems to be a synergistic effect. Same thing as we get a lot of comments from growers about soybeans, right? When we put an insecticide fungicide together, talk about greener, more vigor and all that stuff. Have some type of synergistic effect. Same thing as what we're seeing here. Now on this one back here, we're inoculating with Fusarium. Which plot do you like here? 1, 2, 3, or 4? 2. So number 1's just the fungicide insecticide. 3 was our untreated. 4 was our fungicide. 2 was our fungicide insecticide nematicide. So again, you can see that. So we're really opportunist, or we're really looking forward to some of these seed treatments coming out, these new ones, particularly the seed treatment nematicides, because I think it provides us with an opportunity that we haven't had in the past. When we think of nematodes in general, what's been the main, if we think of soybeans, in soybean cyst nematode, what have been our main 2 management tools that we have available?
Rotation and varieties.
Rotation and, what did we see with the wheat? And those lines and those genes, genetics, right? So resistant varieties and rotation. Now we will probably start seeing seed treatment nematicides as another option for producers as well. And as I said, as I showed here with the Votivo, there's a good option there down the road. And that again is a nice fit, a new technology, a new opportunity for us. Now, and one of the reasons we want to discuss or talk about nematodes in corn is our surveys that we've done from Windsor through to Guelph area. When we're thinking of root lesion nematode as being the primary nematode that can affect corn, our surveys were coming back at about a third, 33% of the fields were at threshold or above, which really surprised me. I was thinking maybe 5%, maybe 10%, but the result was that there were a lot more fields at threshold or above than I would have expected. Those are very similar numbers though than what we see in the corn belt as well. So it seems to be a constant or a consistent situation whether we're here or in the U.S. corn belt. And a number of things are going on there, or we suspect is going on. The old days when we managed insects, in that we used to use in-furrow insecticides a lot. Those in-furrow insecticides had some nematicide properties or some suppression of those nematodes, which allowed the plants to develop, get a head start, and grow. As we removed or went from those in-furrow insecticides now to transgenics, we don't have that suppression anymore. And then also with rotations, more corn, and all of those things in the rotation and the shift in our insecticides, all of those things have probably promoted more of these corn nematodes. So if you've got customers or you're on your farms where you've got chronic problems, so you've got parts of your fields where it doesn't matter if you've got corn, soybeans, wheat growing in there, and there's problems there every year. And you've gone through and you've looked at soil fertility, you've done pH, you've looked at other characteristics there. Think of nematodes. Have those sampled and look for them. Same situation as we saw 10, 20 years ago with soybeans, where growers would call and say, every time I grow soybeans in that field, I'm losing 20%, 30% yield or more. Same situation here. Keep those in mind. Chronic problems could be the result of nematodes. Let's go on the soybeans over here. And so what I'm growing here is a moderately tolerant soybean line to Phytophthora. And again, on this clay soil here, prone to Phytophthora, you can see the untreated control here, where we have a stunting of those plants. You can see the Rhizoctonia inoculum worked very well. Fusarium inoculum worked, not as I would have preferred to see more dead plants, but the thing with the Phytophthora, the Rhizoc, and the Fusarium is that they can affect plants all through the growing season, right? So we're probably going to see more plants die as the season goes on, and that. But compare that to the second treatment here where we have, again, just like with corn, we did a fungicide, insecticide, nematicide, and in this case I threw some extra Allegiance metalaxyl in there. Why would I put metalaxyl? What's the primary reason metalaxyl? The pathogens it affects? It's those oomycetes, right? Those pythiums and phytophthora. So by giving a little extra boost, we're able to manage those as well. And what you can see is where we've had that fungicide, insecticide, nematicide, again, we have pretty good looking plants, right? And we have some good control with the Rhizoctonia and the Fusarium as well. So, as I said, so now we've got seed treatments. Seed treatments or seed is becoming much more complex, just like the plants themselves or the genetics. In the old days where we only had a couple of fungicides, maybe an insecticide, now we're going to have mixtures of different fungicides, insecticides. You throw in a seed treatment nematicide as well. You throw in an inoculant. You throw maybe a stress inducer or reducer in there, and some other stuff. You could have 6, 7, 8 different actives on that seed. So if you're in the seed business, seed is going to become much more complex, more chemistry associated with that seed. And then the other thing is, all of these things are strategies that we have to do prior to the season. We have, from a nematode standpoint, we don't have any within season options other than soil samples just to tell us whether we have cyst or populations, etc., or the root lesion nematode numbers and all that. Something else we've been evaluating and looking at are some of these foliar insecticides that have nematicide properties. One that we've been looking at in conjunction with Bayer is Movento. And so we're looking at these different products that, although they are specifically aimed at insect control, the fact that they can control our aphids and other things, they also have that ability to suppress nematodes and that. So those are some of the things, and those are neat ones in that can provide us with some within season options as well down the road. Let's work our way down here. So as I mentioned, we've got these broad spectrum fungicides and nematicides out there. We're also looking at, and what you'll see down the road, are more targeted seed treatments as well. So things such as this heads up here that we're looking at, which is targeting Sclerotinia or white mold. So now we're going away from a broad spectrum control, now targeting specific problems or weaknesses that we may have. And in this case, you can see that although it may be a white mold type product from a seed standpoint, from a Sclerotinia standpoint, it really doesn't provide us that extra boost when it comes to the phytophoras, the Rhizoctonia, Fusariums. We'll still need to have those broad spectrum fungicides associated with some of these. The same thing with ones that are targeting Rhizoctonia and Fusarium. We still need those phytophora, those pythium seed treatments in there as well. And then down the road we're also looking at, and you'll be seeing much more biologicals all being added onto that. So all of them together look very promising, and it looks like things will be, over the next 3 or 4 years, there'll be many, many new options coming out to the market for us to limit losses to many of these pathogens that we do, both in corn, soybeans, and wheat. So if we think of this year, what's been the general theme this year in terms of planting and the growing season? Been quite stressful, right? And with those stress the plants have been under stress. The fact that is they've also been inoculated or infected right now with many of the common root diseases, and that stress conditions often promote more of these pathogens to develop. So a couple things I'd like you to think about as we progress later on into the season on the corn and soybean side. If we think of stress, and on corn, often when we think of stress, the main things later on, and especially if we end up with fall or late conditions that could impact development, think of the stalk rots in corn. So things such as anthracnose, gibberella, fusarium, diplodia, and pythium. All of these things, pathogens love stress conditions, and they can and probably will be on the rise this fall if the conditions continue in that. And of course their corresponding ear molds, whether it's fusarium, diplodia, penicillium, or gibberella. All of those things if we end up with stress conditions continue through the season, stalk rots, ear molds are probably going to become problematic as well. On the soybean side, we are starting to pick up some of the common foliar diseases, whether it's downy mildew, powdery mildew, the septorias right now. All of those are started, and we're starting to pick those up again. Conditions have been favorable. The wet conditions, humid conditions have been ideal for those. Some of the other ones to keep an eye on are frog eye leaf spot, which is one that we're seeing more of, particularly in the southern parts of the province. And frog eye starts off as these tan circular lesions, has a dark border around it, and then as time progresses, start seeing slits in that tan lesion center, and then it drops out. So you end up with these holes. It's almost like shotguns. On the somebody had taken a shotgun to those leaves, and you end up with those holes. It looks like it resembles insect feeding, but it's the result of the fungal infection. And then the other ones, a lot of the plants, particularly soybeans, have been sitting there. And so the rhizoctonias, the fusariums, and all of those things infect early. A lot of our root diseases and diseases that occur later on have already infected those plants now, and they're just sitting there. So the more stressed the plants become later on, we often will see more symptoms, more disease developing as well. And some of them, such as sudden death syndrome, will sit there until the plants become stressed, or when the plants start to set pods. Often we'll see, once the plants get into reproductive stages, you'll see a lot more of these diseases starting to express themselves as well. SDS starts to infect within the first 2 to 3 weeks of that plant's development, so a lot of them are already infected, just waiting for stress down the road. And to distinguish between sudden death syndrome symptoms and brown stem rot, they both produce this intervenal yellowing between the veins. The yellowing then turns brown, necrosis, and all that tissue will disappear. You'll end up with just the veins, and then those leaves will fall off. And you're left with just the petioles. But what you want to do is cut those stems, look at the stem itself. With brown stem rot, the browning is within the stem, in the pith. The outside of the stem stays white. With sudden death syndrome, the pith will stay white or green. The browning will be just on the inside of the stem, the vascular bundles in there. So you can distinguish between an SDS and brown stem rot pretty easily. And then if we end up with any situations where we have a delay in harvest and those plants end up sitting out in the field for any length of time, we have to be on the lookout for some of those phomopsis and some of the seed molds as well. So something to just think about.